Welcome into the Stack Shack podcast. Wow, am I glad I didn't record this video sooner. Breaking news as of recording this right now. Nick Saban is retiring from Alabama. Reports from multiple different outlets all started with Chris Lowe today. He's apparently informed his team and the powers that be at Alabama that he is retiring. He is 72 years old and just completed his 17th season at Alabama. They just made it again to the college football playoff. Had a bit of an up and down year, but Nick Saban is retiring, leaves a storied career. I may have not been the biggest Alabama fan in my life. I was more of a Florida Gator kid if we're talking SEC teams. And then I think it's pretty clear where my allegiances lie elsewhere with Notre Dame. But you got to respect what Saban did. Won so many games and won multiple championships, 12 conference titles in his career, 19 bowl game wins. It's impressive. He never had a losing season. Never had a losing season. That's incredibly impressive in his 28 years as a college football head coach. Incredible. Very impressive. Got to give him some credit. He did have the losing season in the NFL, but in college football will go down as maybe the greatest college football coach ever. Definitely in that conversation. So this marks what this video was going to be about, was kind of the end of the college football playoff era as we know it. We were going to do some fun things looking back at the past 10 years of the college football playoff, and we're still going to get to those, but I just want to get into my thoughts on this Nick Saban situation. I don't feel like we saw this coming necessarily, but I do think there may have been some signs. Very curious to see who's going to replace him. That's probably the biggest question on everybody's mind. Who is going to be the head coach at Alabama? I mean, we're talking 17 years. I barely remember before Alabama had Nick Saban. I do, but not much. I mean, we're talking the last 17 years, and how much college football has changed. Who's going to be the head coach there? Very, very interesting question. I think you might put early money, so to speak, on Tommy Rees. He's obviously inexperienced, and that's why I would feel like Alabama would bring somebody in who's experienced. I mean, who wants to follow Nick Saban in Alabama? That is just a rough, that's a rough, short straw to draw. But I do think there are some signs that maybe point to Tommy Rees. There were quite a few questions last season when he moved from Notre Dame to Alabama. But a lateral move. He went from offensive coordinator, quarterbacks coach at Notre Dame to offensive coordinator, quarterbacks coach at Alabama. And a lot of people were a little confused and a little caught off guard. He'd only had 1 year working along Marcus Freeman, who, that was a situation with Brian Kelly departing. Kelly reportedly wanted Tommy to come with him to LSU, but Tommy said, no, I want to stay here at Notre Dame. I went to Notre Dame. I played quarterback for Notre Dame. I've coached at Notre Dame now. This is where I want to be. He was very vocal about that to the players and to the rest of the staff. And then after 1 season under Marcus, he makes the jump to Alabama. And not as a promotion. Again, he stayed in the same position. But I do wonder if it was a bit of a trial run, so to speak. Like, okay, Tommy, we really like you. If you come to Alabama, there's a chance you could be Nick's successor, right? Because he obviously was not going to be the successor of Marcus Freeman unless Marcus got fired. But if they were that bad, in these first couple of years under Marcus, they probably wouldn't have kept Tommy either, right? So Marcus is a young guy at Notre Dame. Not a lot of opportunity there to take the head coaching job probably from him at Notre Dame if you're Tommy. So maybe this was a move for Tommy to say, hey, I want to be a head coach eventually. Let me go get a year under Saban, arguably one of the greatest coaches ever, or the greatest coach ever. Go get a year under Saban and then fill in for his shoes because he's thinking of retiring. Might be the play. I don't know. Tommy's very young, has never been a head coach before. It would be a bit unorthodox to, bring him in 1 year as an offensive coordinator, especially when he's getting heat over how that offense performed this season, especially the final play call, to then promote him to head coach. Like, I just didn't hear a lot of rumblings about how much they loved Tommy there. Not that there was necessarily a bunch of hate for Tommy. It was an up and down season. They're breaking in, a new quarterback, Milroe. Milroe has definitely had his struggles this season. The offense was not really, I would say, as loaded as it has been previously. So I think it's interesting that Saban walks away now. And really it goes into perfectly what I was thinking about talking about a lot in this video, which is kind of the end of an era in college football. Obviously with NIL, the transfer portal, these new systems in place in college football. Personally, I'm kind of all for it. I think there needs to be better structure and rules in place regarding NIL and transfers and when you can and can't. And, I have some concerns about playing in bowl games, although I think the college football playoff expansion is going to, help with that. There's a lot of different, thoughts and feelings in college football's changing a lot right now. And it is the end of the 4-team playoff. We've had it for 10 years. And now we're moving on with out Nick Saban, who's been a stable force within college football. I think, if I'm Nick trying to understand why he would do this, he is 72. He's won some rings. A bunch of conference realignment is coming next season. It's getting harder to recruit because of early signing period and transfer portal and all this stuff. You really don't get any days off anymore. It used to be people would talk about college football was a good place if you want to be a high-profile head coach. NFL versus college. College allowed you to have a little more family time, a little bit, of a break, whereas the NFL was pretty much 24/7. It's almost flipped. It's actually worse, I think, for college coaches now because of how much they have to recruit, how much time they're spending on the road. Got to talk not only to high school kids recruiting, but also to those transfer portal individuals coming from other teams. And it's just a lot to manage, If I was 72, had essentially accomplished what I wanted, this might be the perfect time. You also have to look at the SEC's not going to get easier next year. The rise of certain teams, and this is not Nick's fault in any way, but for much of his most dominant seasons, and for the last 17 seasons, and maybe we would say the last 7 to 10 are the ones where Alabama was really, just winning titles over and over and over, or at least in the title game, right? Saban had the benefit of Texas wasn't very good. Texas has not been good in the last 10 years until this season. USC has really been down and a disaster. Michigan was pretty bad until Harbaugh came. And so from a competitive standpoint of the kind of blue bloods of recruiting Georgia was not great. Florida had this big down, has been bad in the last 10 years since Urban Meyer left. Auburn has not been great besides the Cam Newton year. And even then, they needed some miracles, right? So you look at the last 10 years, recruiting-wise, everybody's going to Alabama. That has gotten much more competitive now. Not only does the transfer portal allow, you lock up a recruit out of high school, he comes to Alabama. If he's not getting playing time, he can transfer out, right? So not only are you not able to maybe build quite the depth that you used to, where it was like every year you're just putting in a new guy for 1 year, sending him to the NFL, right? Now some of those players are wanting to transfer, go to other schools. And as some of these other big schools have kind of locked in good coaches, Texas finally feels back now. USC, Lincoln Riley. USC's now recruiting a little better. Notre Dame's recruiting better. Michigan, Harbaugh's built that into something. Ohio State is still around. Florida State is coming back, right? Some of these bigger brands, it's just going to be more and more difficult for Saban to build really deep, really strong. I mean, those Alabama teams in the past 10 years, there's been a lot of years where they were just clearly superior in every position than anybody they played. And that's becoming more difficult in this modern age of college football, and give credit to some of the other coaches building some good programs out there. Washington has now become a thing. Oregon is kind of re-solidified itself under Dan Lanning after Chip Kelly was gone. USC has a coach now. Michigan has a coach now. Florida State seems to have figured out their problems that were really bad there for a while. And you have the fact that there is a lot of transfers as far as players from different teams going different places if they're not playing. So all of that to make recruiting more difficult, more time consuming, and harder to gain a superior advantage like he used to have. The Alabama teams the last couple of years have not quite looked the same. I would say the last 2, maybe 3 years, they haven't looked quite the same. I'd say the last 2 years. They've looked a bit beatable in a lot of places. I mean, even this season, early on, couldn't figure out the quarterback situation. And then even late, they barely beat Auburn. Probably should have lost that game. They couldn't keep up with Michigan. That's just how it goes. So, more difficult in recruiting, more difficult to gain the best players. But not only that, we have this huge conference realignment coming next year. Again, another end of the era, Pac-12 becoming the Pac-2. Those teams are going to play with the Mountain West Conference. Bunch of teams coming into the SEC. That Texas team that just beat Alabama in Alabama. Oh, now they're in your conference. Now this is not an out-of-conference game that, oh, well, that's just these 2 years and then we don't have to play them next year. Oh, no. If they're good, you're going to have to play them every year if you're, trying to make it through the SEC and be an SEC champion. You're going to have to deal with Texas. Oklahoma. Little rocky after Lincoln Riley's left, but Vrabel's this season seemed to stabilize them a little bit. Still a little inconsistent. We'll see what they are next year, but they're a legitimate program that's going to be recruiting and causing problems for you. So, all of that to say, it does in some ways, I think, to me, seem like a good time to step away if you're Nick. It's a good opportunity to say, so long college football, it's been a good run, 28 seasons as a head coach, 17 seasons with Alabama. There you go. I mean, we're talking multiple championships, 7 national championships. There you go. time to ride off into the sunset. I think it's a good opportunity. We will definitely be keeping a close eye on who does Alabama go with as a coach for next season. Going to be very, very interesting. Going to be very interesting from recruiting and transfers as well. Is there a mass exodus from Alabama of like, oh, well, I came here to play for Saban, I'm leaving? We'll have to see. So those are my thoughts on Saban, on that situation. Now let's move on to kind of what I was really expecting to talk about in today's video, which is the recap of the season in college football and maybe a little look back on the previous college football playoff. We're going to rank the top 10 teams and think about that as well. But let's start by talking about the Washington-Michigan game. Congrats to Michigan first and foremost. They get their national championship. Good for them. Congratulations, Michigan. The score here is very lopsided looking, but this game was not lopsided. This was a 13-20 game up until the very, very end. Okay? So, it looks like Michigan really beat up Washington. They didn't. This was a close game up until the end. This game went really mostly how I expected. I thought Michigan would be able to run the ball. They started by running the ball very well. And Washington had some moments of explosive offense, except something was off with Washington in this game. And, maybe part of that is just jitters, experience. This was a Michigan team that was in the playoff last year, right? Thought they had it last year. Upset by TCU. I don't think it would have mattered who won that game. That Georgia team that year was just going to blow everybody out. But get upset by TCU, let the game kind of get away from them, weren't able to bring it back. So this was a more experienced Michigan team than the Washington team as far as playoff experience, and I think that did help. But I don't know. I'm very curious to see. I don't think I've seen any reports out about Penix's injury situation. He was definitely grabbing his ribs towards the end of the game. But I would say from the very start, Penix seemed off. And, the Penix we saw against Texas and then the Penix we saw against Michigan were very different. So the question is, why? Why was Washington's offense? I thought, and this is why I took Washington plus the points, I thought, well, Michigan will probably be able to score points on that defense. I think they'll be able to run the ball. There's probably a good chance Michigan wins this game. But Washington, their offense is so explosive, they'll keep it close. Like, I was more expecting the score to look closer than the game really was. Washington gets a couple of big play touchdowns. You add, 14 points to this or whatever. All right, now you're at 29, 28. We're starting to get close to my 4.5 gap, right? But those plays just weren't there. Washington had so many opportunities, but they were stifled by Michigan's front. Michigan's front four. Graham and Grant there at the defensive tackles, I would say especially, dominated this game. And I don't know if their effect is really even shown on the stat line the way it really was. To me, Michael Penix was scared for his life from the very beginning. He was terrified. You could see it in his body language. He would throw the ball and then he would cower. He would throw the ball and turn his back. He would throw the ball and try not to get hit. He was scared. He looked down. He dumped it off. When he had some opportunities to go down the field, maybe dumped it off a little early because he was afraid of that front four. And Michigan was able to inflict that fear and terror and impose their will, rushing 4 guys. They didn't really blitz much in this game. Those front 4 dominated this game, and that is why Michigan won. I don't particularly think Michigan's offense was very good. They broke off 2 big runs, which were huge for them. But besides that, the Washington defense, I actually thought played pretty darn well. They had those 2 big runs, and then the terrible Penix interception, and there's 17 of the 34 points, right? They figured it out. Those 2 big runs early, it was like, oh boy, this might be a blowout. Then they figured out the gaps. They figured out the formations. They filled much better. Michigan still obviously scored points, was still able to move the ball some, but overall, I was actually pretty impressed with the Huskies defense. I thought it was going to be the other way around. I thought this was going to maybe turn into a bit of a shootout with, could Washington's offense score enough points, you know? Would Michigan be able to keep Washington off the field enough? That really didn't happen. Washington had plenty of opportunities. They just did not capitalize. So, very interesting to me, this game. It's all about that front 4 for Michigan, I think. That is the reason they won. And sometimes you can just have that dominant of a group on your team, and it just ruins everything Washington can do. Like we said going into this game, Washington matched up incredibly well against Texas. Incredibly well against Texas. Because what was Texas' weakness? Secondary. Washington did not match up as well against Michigan. I would actually make an argument that from a matchup perspective, Texas might match up against Michigan better than Washington did, just because Texas had a pretty dominant run defense. Now, the Washington defense, give them credit, played much better than I was expecting. So, you know, I don't know. Washington is a better team than Texas. Matchup-wise, on paper, does Texas maybe look a little better than Michigan? Maybe. But I was expecting the Washington offense to be much more productive than it was. It wasn't. We'll see what this does to the draft stock of Penix. I don't think McCarthy really affected his draft stock in this game. But yeah, very interesting to see. We also have a lot of rumors with Michigan following this game. Harbaugh, what is he going to do? That's going to be a very interesting thing to follow. So, exciting game. This might be the best college football playoff we've had in all 10 years. Both semifinal games were fantastic. And the national championship game was a 1-score game until like 7 minutes to go in the 4th quarter. Like it really was a close, hard-fought game until the very end, till the last 5 minutes or so. So, awesome. College football is looking better than ever, and it's the perfect time to now be going to the expanded playoff. I cannot wait. So what does that expanded playoff look like? Well, CBS Sports is already making their picks for who they think are going to be the 12 teams in 2024. Pretty exciting. They are doing these picks from a 6-6, so the top 6 conference champions, and then 6 at large. I think that will change, and they do too. Probably going to move to 5 and 7. That's the leading suspect because the Pac-12 is going away. But here's their college football playoff matchups. Man, these are going to be fun games. Now, Boise State is the one that they have getting in as the 6th conference champion. And like we said in a couple videos ago on my video on why the conference champion of 6, that number just doesn't make sense for the college football playoff. Go check that if you're interested. But that's what they got. That's what they're going with. But, I mean, look at these teams. Georgia, they think is going to be the number 1 seed. And it is true. Beck's back. I think this Georgia team showed in their bowl game, especially, with how many people played in it and how they beat down Florida State, this Georgia team was mad that they lost that SEC championship game, and they're feeling ready to lock and load, get back to their national championship ways. Back-to-back champions coming into this season. So that'll be interesting. They're projecting them as the SEC champion. Michigan coming back as a Big Ten champion. I do think if Jim Harbaugh leaves, Michigan could be in trouble in the Big Ten or Big 12, Big 18, the big conference. They did show, and this is the argument that they're making here in this article, that, hey, they won without Harbaugh 6 times this season. If you look at who they're playing against, besides Ohio State, it wasn't the most dominant season ever. It was dominant in the scores, but they didn't really play a lot of high-end opponents in those 6 games that Harbaugh was not in. I mean, I think Michigan could beat Bowling Green with whoever they wanted to put in at coach, you know? So that's how it works. I do think Washington, Oregon, UCLA, and USC coming into the Big Ten. I'm not sure. If Jim Harbaugh leaves, I'm not sure they're the Big Ten champions. I think you got to watch out for Oregon. I think you got to watch out for USC, UCLA, Washington. I think Penn State might be on the rise. Ohio State's going to want revenge. It might be a little tricky there, but we'll see. Clemson, the ACC is definitely wide open, as they say. I don't know. DJ Uiagalelei heading to Florida State. I think Mike Norvell's got something there. Gonna be kind of a 2-team battle between Clemson and Florida State, I think. I would actually probably lean Florida State. It's interesting that they don't have them. Oklahoma State, they put in as the Big 12 champion. Kind of interesting. But you got Texas and Oklahoma leaving. So, yeah, maybe. Texas being an at-large team. Sure. With Quinn Ewers coming back, that's huge for Texas. I think Texas could be dangerous in the SEC. They have Alabama in. I might make the hot take. Obviously, this article was written when Coach Nick Saban and offensive coordinator Tommy Rees will have an offseason to prepare. Nick Saban ain't there. I would make the argument that I don't think Alabama gets in. I think somebody else is getting in. Maybe an Ole Miss, although I think Ole Miss gets in the 12-team playoff regardless in their eyes. So Washington gets in. Notre Dame gets in. Some big pickups. I think Notre Dame is a sneaky team that people aren't talking about. And I think the other sneaky team is Utah. Cam Rising's back. This was a team that a lot of people projected to be a top 4 team in the country this season because they expected Cam Rising to play. He's didn't. Injury took longer to heal. But he will be back next season. Yeah. Couple of sneaky teams here at 8 and 9. Notre Dame, yes, they're replacing a quarterback, but they're potentially replacing him with Riley Leonard, Duke's former quarterback, who is definitely maybe Heisman Trophy caliber play. A true legit competitive guy. Has been winning a lot of games at Duke with Duke talent, and now he's got Notre Dame talent. And Notre Dame is returning a bunch of dudes, especially on defense. They are loaded on defense. This might be one of the historically best defenses of all time next season. And I know I'm a Notre Dame fan, but go look at who they're returning. It includes the number 1 defensive player of last season, and they added multiple people on the defensive line in the transfer portal. Dominant edge rusher. They still have probably the best corner in college football. It's littered with some serious talent. Very experienced linebacking core with some young talent coming in that's pretty good. That defense is going to be good. I think Utah's a team They get forgotten about because of the loss of Cam Rising this season, but they're definitely the team that's a quarterback away from being pretty darn good. And Cam Rising's coming back, and we know he's good. Ole Miss, interesting. I think Ole Miss actually takes Alabama's spot. And maybe Alabama sneaks in here at 10 or 11 or 12. That might be how it works. Tulane and Boise State. But again, like we said, Boise State being the 6th conference champion, it probably will change to the 7-5 model, like I said. In that case, watch out for potentially an Oregon State. It's had some ups and downs, but will be playing a little easier schedule next year with the Mountain West opponents, but could look pretty good in those. Keep an eye on Florida State, though. I'm very surprised they don't have Florida State in this list. Very intriguing to me. But we'll have to see. That is their picks. Those are my thoughts on who they think are going to be in the 12-team playoff. And that's who I think is going to be in the 12-team playoff. To wrap up our kind of ode to the college football playoff, there were 10 years, there's 10 teams. USA Today came out with a great article a couple of days ago or yesterday, ranking the top 10 teams. Like, who was the best team? There's, talk of this Michigan team. How do they rank against the other great national championship teams? Let's just go through this list. It'll be fun here at the end of the video, a good way to end, to think back on all the great years that the college football playoff did give us. Wasn't without controversy. Obviously, Florida State this year, the TCU snub early. There's been some great storylines. So let's just go through these teams. I'm going to give my thoughts on where I think USA Today is right and where I think they are wrong. Or I guess not necessarily USA Today, but Paul here. Let's see where Paul's right and wrong. He ranks the 2020 Alabama team as the number 1 team in the last 10 years. Makes some good arguments. It was the COVID year, which is a bit, tricky, but they beat 11 SEC teams. They beat Notre Dame. They beat Ohio State. They won by at least 15 points in every game. They were pretty darn dominant. I would argue, though, that the 2022 Georgia team was better. This is the team that beat 5 top 15 teams on their run. This was not during a COVID year when you had, people sitting out and all this stuff. And they absolutely obliterated a TCU team in the national championship game. And people want to say, oh, well, yeah, because TCU shouldn't have been in there. TCU beat Michigan. They beat Michigan. This was not TCU was most deserving and got into the playoff, and then Georgia waxed them in the first round. No. TCU beat Michigan and then got walloped by Georgia. And that Georgia team, Ohio State played them close-ish, the closest anybody did that season. But, oh my goodness. That Georgia team, to me, this was the best team I've ever seen in college football. Well, I should say, the best team I saw in the past 10 years in college football. Behind them, they got the LSU team. I think this is almost correct. So I would move the 2022 Georgia team to number 1. I would move the 2020 Alabama team to number 3. And instead of moving LSU up, I think this 2018 Clemson team is a little underrated on this list. I would say this is the second best team. I would say it goes the Georgia 2022 and then the 2018 Clemson. This 2018 Clemson team had that Christian Wilkins-led defensive line where, they run 4 defensive linemen, and I think 5 of them went in the first couple of rounds of the draft. This defensive line was so incredibly dominant. and they blasted Notre Dame, and they blasted a pretty darn good Alabama team. And this was a pretty good Notre Dame team. Notre Dame had a injury to their corner in this game, and that's when it really got blown open. But that defense, look at that. 3 points to Notre Dame. 16 points to Alabama. This was not a bad Alabama team, and that was not a bad Notre Dame team. To me, this Clemson team gets underrated. I know that LSU has probably the greatest offense of all of these teams, but how I would do it, Georgia 1, Clemson 2, Alabama 3, LSU 4, so LSU drops 1 spot, in my opinion. Man, this team will forever be remembered as probably the best college offense. Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Are you kidding me? That is better than most NFL teams can line up. I mean, you're talking probably the 2 best receivers in the NFL. Top 2 quarterback, probably. Definitely top 3. And a very decent running back. He's had some injury issues and, not been super available. But if you remember his rookie year in Kansas City, when he first came out, he was pretty darn productive. They rolled over everybody. They just could score more points than anybody. It didn't really matter about the defense, but because their defense wasn't maybe as great as some of these other teams, they weren't as complete maybe as the 2020 Alabama team or definitely the 2022 Georgia team, but they definitely deserve to be in the top 5. I would put them at 4. The rest, I actually really agree with how USA Today ranked these. The 2021 Georgia team was very good. They did have the 1 loss to Alabama in the SEC championship game, which they then avenged quite aggressively there in the playoff title game. This was their first championship. Was pretty exciting. They put the Michigan team here. Once you get out of the top 5, to me, the next 5, there's a lot of kind of interchangeability. Maybe the bottom 2, you might leave to themselves, but 6, 7, 8 here, Michigan, Clemson, and the 2015 Alabama team. I put them pretty similar. Michigan did go undefeated, so sure, let's put them 6. There you go. That's where it's at. Clemson had a loss in that year. Alabama had a loss in that year. So hard to put them ahead of an undefeated team that beat an Ohio State team that was pretty good, beat a Penn State team, beat an Alabama team, and then beat a pretty darn good Washington team as well, right? The bottom, rounding it out here, Ohio State and Alabama. I think this is exactly right. That 2014 Ohio State team, this is a team that had Cardell Jones as their 3rd-string quarterback, right? But this team was really the Ezekiel Elliott team. Now, what I will say about this 2014 Ohio State team is Ezekiel Elliott's performance in these playoffs is the most dominant single-player performance I've ever seen in college football. He took over against Alabama and against Oregon. The Alabama game in particular, if you want to watch some great highlights of running backs, go watch the Ezekiel Elliott footage from that Alabama game. And their offensive line deserves a bunch of credit. But Alabama doesn't get pushed around much. Ohio State mauled Alabama in that game. It was honestly shocking. The 2017 Alabama, this was a team that lost the Iron Bowl and therefore didn't even play in the SEC championship game. But did end up pulling off the national championship game, the big Jalen Hurts Tua swap. How interesting was that? Very exciting. The rise of Tua Tagovailoa. the fall of Jalen Hurts that then turned into the rise of the Jalen Hurts the next season and all of that. So exciting, but yeah, these two teams, obviously, they are national champions, and therefore they are very good football teams. But if you're looking at them compared to, say, this Michigan team's better. Those Georgia teams the last couple years, that Clemson team in 2018, the Joe Burrow offense in LSU, it makes perfect sense. So, again, how I'd have it, I would move the Alabama team down a few slots. I would say the 2022 Georgia team is number 1. 2018 Clemson is number 2. Followed by the 2020 Alabama at number 3. And then LSU at number 4. The rest of the teams, I'd leave them the same. 5 through 10, really don't have much of a problem with. I think they did a good job making this list. Let me know down in the comments your favorite memory from the past 10 years of college football. What do you think about the Nick Saban news? This, I mean, just broke as I was recording this video, so wild. Not a lot of information out yet on what Alabama's going to do. Let me know down below what you think they're going to do, and we'll see you tomorrow. If there's new news on Nick Saban, we'll probably be covering it to an extent, but yeah, what an era for college football. On to the next. I think it's going to be better. I can't wait for 12-team playoff next season. College football can't come soon enough. I know it can't for me. Hopefully, you're as excited as I am, and we'll see you tomorrow.